Sarah's day started like any other. It was early morning, and she was going through her usual routine: school, meeting friends, preparing for her classes. Today felt like it was going to be a busy day, but nothing out of the ordinary. Her locker opened with a familiar click as she entered the combination. She was used to the rush, the constant movement around her, and the hum of voices as students chatted in the hallway. Nothing felt unusual. As Sarah walked through the school halls, she glanced around. Friends were talking, some were glued to their phones, and others were discussing their next class. The atmosphere was typical, like every other school day. Sarah liked this routine. It was predictable. She knew what was coming: another busy day at school. Nothing special, just the usual. But as she approached her locker, something caught her eye. It was an envelope sitting inside her locker, tucked in between her books. There was no name, no return address, just a plain white envelope. At first, Sarah thought it was just some prank, maybe one of her friends playing around. But when she picked it up, something felt off. Something about it didn't sit right with her. Was it a joke, or was it something more? Sarah carefully unfolded the piece of paper inside the envelope. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. As her eyes scanned the words, she felt a chill run down her spine. The message was short, but it felt like a warning. "You don't know me, but I know you. Be careful who you trust." The words didn't make sense. Who would send her something like this, and why? Her mind raced with questions. Who would be watching her? Was this some sort of sick joke, or was it more than that? She stared at the message, turning the paper over, but there was nothing more. No clue, no signature. Just those cryptic words. She looked around, but no one seemed to notice her. The school buzzed with the usual chaos, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Her heart started beating faster and her palms began to sweat. She stuffed the note back into her bag and tried to shake off the feeling of unease. It could just be a prank, right? But deep down, Sarah couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. Something wasn't adding up. She tried to focus on the rest of the day, but her mind kept drifting back to that note. Who had sent it, and why? Was she just overthinking things, or was there more to this than she realized? Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the note. Every time she tried to focus on something else, her mind drifted back to those words. Be careful who you trust. Who could have left it for her, and what did it mean? That night, after finishing her homework, she decided to look through her bag again. Maybe there was something she missed, something that could explain who sent the note. She pulled out the crumpled paper and reread it. No hidden clues. Nothing that could help her make sense of it. The more Sarah thought about it, the more anxious she became. Could it be someone at school? Someone who knew something about her? She started thinking about her friends. Was there anyone who would do something like this? She picked up her phone and started scrolling through her contact list. Everyone seemed normal. Friends, classmates, even teachers. But someone must have known about her. Someone must have seen something. But who? As Sarah stared at the screen, she remembered something. A few days ago, she had noticed a stranger watching her from across the street. It was the same feeling, like someone was always just a little too close. But she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it wasn't. But now, with the note in her hands, those thoughts started to resurface. Had she ignored something important? She knew she had to find answers. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. She felt like she was being pulled into something bigger than herself, but she had no idea where it would lead. All she knew was that she couldn't ignore it any longer. The next day at school, Sarah was on edge. She couldn't focus on anything. Her mind kept racing back to the note. Every time she passed someone in the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her. As the bell rang, Signaling the start of the next class, Sarah walked slowly to her locker. She kept her head down, trying not to draw attention to herself. But just as she reached for her combination, she noticed something strange. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was a student she didn't recognize, standing still, staring in her direction. The figure didn't move, just stood there, locked in place, watching her. Sarah's heart raced. She couldn't even tell if it was a boy or a girl, the distance too far to make out any details. But the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. She hurriedly opened her locker, throwing her books inside, keeping her eyes on the figure. The moment she closed the locker, the stranger disappeared around the corner. Was it the same person from the street? Sarah didn't know, but she couldn't ignore the gut feeling that something was off. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sarah couldn't concentrate, couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there waiting for the right moment. Who was this person? Why were they following her? Was it just paranoia, or was there something more sinister happening? By the time the final bell rang, Sarah felt exhausted. She needed answers, but each step she took seemed to lead her further into a web of confusion and fear. That night, as Sarah sat alone in her room, the thought kept repeating itself. Who could it be? Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Whoever this was, they were playing a dangerous game, and she had no idea what the next move would be. It was late that evening when Sarah decided she couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the uncertainty, the feeling that someone was lurking in the shadows, it was all too much. She had to know the truth. After dinner, she grabbed her jacket and slipped out of the house. The streets were quiet, the air cold and crisp. Sarah's footsteps echoed as she walked down the familiar path to the park, the place where she first saw the stranger. She had to see if they were still there. Her mind raced as she approached the spot. Every noise made her jump. A distant car passing, a dog barking in the distance. It all felt like a part of this nightmare. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but her gut told her something wasn't right. As she neared the park, Sarah saw a shadow dart across the street. It was quick, barely noticeable, but it was there. Was it them? She didn't wait to find out. She sprinted to the corner of the park, hiding behind a tree, her breath shallow and quick. Her heart thudded in her chest. Could it be the same person again? Who were they, and what did they want from her? From the corner of her eye, Sarah saw movement, a figure emerging from the dark shadows of the park. It wasn't the stranger from earlier. This was someone she recognized, someone she never expected to see at this hour. It was Ethan, a classmate of hers. He was looking around nervously, glancing back toward the street, before he took a step toward her hiding spot. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Ethan's voice startled her. She stepped out from behind the tree, her face flushed with confusion and anger. "Why are you following me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What's going on? I've seen you around. Why have you been watching me?" Ethan looked taken aback, his face growing pale. What are you talking about?" His eyes darted nervously, as if searching for an escape. Sarah was firm, her mind racing. "I know it's you. I've seen you. You're the one leaving the notes, right?" Ethan took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "I never meant for you to get caught up in this, but I couldn't let you get hurt." Sarah's confusion deepened. "Hurt? By who?" Ethan hesitated, then finally spoke in a low voice. "I've been trying to protect you. There's someone dangerous watching you, someone who has been keeping track of everything you do." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Who are you talking about? Why me?" Ethan looked at her with a mixture of regret and fear. "I didn't want to get you involved, but you've been a target for a while. I thought if I could warn you, you might understand." Sarah's mind spun with confusion. A target? Who would want to hurt her, and why hadn't Ethan said anything sooner? She stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in, but they made no sense. Who was the real threat? Was Ethan a friend, or was he a part of something bigger? As the night grew colder, Sarah knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Whoever was behind this, they weren't just going to let it go. She had no choice but to find out who was pulling the strings before it was too late. The next morning, Sarah woke with a sense of urgency in her chest, as if her heart had been racing all night. The letter, Ethan, the feeling of being watched. Everything felt tangled together in a knot that she couldn't quite unravel. She couldn't shake the thought that something dark was lurking just beyond her reach. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her bed. It was a message from Ethan. "We need to talk." She stared at the screen for a long moment, hesitation and uncertainty pressing down on her. But then, something deep inside her urged her to take control, to understand. She couldn't just wait around for answers anymore. She had to do something. With a sigh, Sarah threw off the covers and stood up. She grabbed her jacket, slinging it over her shoulders, and without a second thought, she left the house. There was no turning back now. Her mind was set. She was going to find out what was really going on, and nothing was going to stop her. The streets were empty as she made her way toward the park again. It felt like she was walking into an unknown world, one that was filled with dangers she hadn't anticipated, but she couldn't turn back. Not now. As she approached the park, she saw Ethan sitting on the bench, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes darting back and forth nervously. When he saw her, he stood up quickly. "Sarah," he greeted her, his voice tense, "I'm glad you came. We don't have much time." Ethan's urgency unsettled Sarah even more. "What is this about? What's going on, Ethan? Why have you been watching me? What does this all mean?" she demanded, her voice shaking with both fear and determination. Ethan hesitated, looking around as though checking to see if anyone was listening. "It's not safe here. We can't talk about this in public," he whispered urgently. "Meet me at my place tonight. I'll tell you everything then." As Sarah walked away from Ethan, her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Her mind raced with a million questions, but for now there was only one answer. She had to find out the truth. Ethan's warning, the strange messages, the feeling of being followed, it all pointed to something far bigger than she had imagined. She knew what she had to do next. That night, she would go to Ethan's place, but what awaited her there, she couldn't possibly know. All she could do was hope that whatever happened, she would finally get the answers she so desperately needed. Sarah sat in her room, the weight of the letter heavy in her hands. The first one, the one she'd received yesterday, still seemed so surreal. What kind of person would leave such a message without revealing who they were? She couldn't stop thinking about it. The cryptic words, the promise of secrets, the dark undertone, it all felt like a puzzle she needed to solve. But as much as she tried to convince herself that it was just some twisted prank, something told her it was much bigger than that. She hadn't told anyone, not her best friend, Emily, not even her parents. Who could she trust with something like this? What if they thought she was crazy? The silence of the house only made it worse. Each creak of the floorboards, each flutter of the curtains made her feel like she was being watched. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. "We need to talk. Tonight. 8 p.m. Ethan, of course. He'd been so cryptic when they spoke earlier that day. He'd acted nervous, jittery even. But something in the way he looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes, left her with a feeling of doubt. Was he hiding something? She had tried to push away the doubts. Maybe he was just as confused as she was. But there was something off about him, something that felt almost like manipulation. The day dragged on, her thoughts constantly drifting back to Ethan and the letter. What did he know? Why was he so eager to meet with her? Her mind started racing, thinking of all the possibilities. Could it all just be a coincidence? But deep down, Sarah knew better. There was no way this was just a random series of events. She'd felt it in her gut from the very beginning. She glanced over at her reflection in the window, staring at her own face as if it was someone else. How had everything gotten so complicated? Everything had been normal just a few days ago. She had a life, a routine. Then that letter arrived, and suddenly everything felt distorted. Was she going mad? At 7:45 p.m., Sarah stood up from her desk, the weight of the decision now settling heavily on her shoulders. She had a choice to make. She could go to Ethan's place, like he'd asked, and find out what was going on, what he knew, or she could stay home, ignore it all and pretend none of this was happening. But deep down, she knew she couldn't run from it. Her fingers hovered over her phone's screen as she typed a quick reply. "I'll be there at 8. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed send. The thought of seeing Ethan, of confronting him with her suspicions, made her heart race in a way she wasn't entirely comfortable with. But she had to do it. If she wanted answers, she had to take control of the situation. The streetlights flickered as Sarah walked down the street toward Ethan's apartment, the city's noise distant in the background. She tried to calm herself, to stop imagining worst-case scenarios, but the truth was, she couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. What if Ethan was involved in something she didn't understand? What if he was playing her, leading her into a trap? Or worse, what if he wasn't the one she needed to fear at all? When Sarah finally arrived at his building, she stood outside for a moment, staring up at the second-floor window where she knew Ethan's apartment was. She couldn't help but feel a chill in her spine. There was something unsettling about the silence of the night. No cars, no pedestrians, just the quiet hum of the city in the distance. She took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. As she waited, a feeling of dread washed over her. Something told her that once she stepped inside, her life would never be the same. It was as if the world she once knew was slipping away, and whatever lay ahead would change everything. The unknown stretched before her, and with it, a growing sense of doubt that she couldn't ignore. Sarah stepped into Ethan's apartment, greeted by the dim, moody light of his living room. The place was quiet, eerily quiet. Ethan wasn't sitting on the couch like she'd expected. Instead, he appeared from the hallway, looking more nervous than usual. His eyes avoided hers, darting back and forth as he motioned for her to sit down. "Hey, thanks for coming," Ethan said, his voice sounding almost too calm, too controlled. Sarah took a seat on the edge of the couch, her body tense, her mind racing. She studied him carefully. There was something off about his demeanor tonight. His usual warmth had vanished, replaced with a cold, almost distant air. "What's going on, Ethan?" Sarah asked, her voice betraying the nervousness she felt inside. She could feel the weight of the letter she hadn't shared with him hanging in the air between them like an unspoken truth. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved toward a small table by the door and picked up something. A folder, one that looked as if it had been tucked away for a while. He handed it to her without a word. Sarah hesitated for a moment before taking the folder. It wasn't just the folder that caught her attention, it was the way Ethan had handed it over. There was something almost too deliberate about his actions, as though he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to be in this exact place, at this exact time. It made her stomach turn. Opening the folder, she found pages of documents, some kind of report. A chill ran down her spine as she scanned the contents. It was about the letters, about her, the very thing she had been trying to figure out. "Where did you get these?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. Ethan's gaze shifted to the floor, his hands nervously clasped in front of him. He cleared his throat. I didn't think you were ready to know, but you need to understand, Sarah. Things are more complicated than they seem." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The words, "more complicated," seemed to hang in the air, suffocating her. Complicated how? She asked, now more suspicious than ever. What are you not telling me, Ethan? He took a slow breath, his eyes meeting hers with an expression she couldn't quite place. It's not just a letter, Sarah. It's a message from someone who knows everything about you. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. What do you mean, someone who knows everything about me? Ethan looked at her, then down at the floor as though struggling to find the right words. For a moment, Sarah thought he might say something, some revelation that would finally make sense of everything. But instead, his voice dropped to a whisper. You have a past, Sarah. A past that you might not even remember. She blinked, a sudden sense of vertigo sweeping over her. What are you talking about? Ethan hesitated, then spoke with a quiet urgency. I'm trying to protect you, but the truth, it's going to change everything. There are things you don't remember, things you need to know before it's too late. Her mind whirled. What was he saying? Was this all connected to the mysterious letters? Did they know something about her she didn't? Was he talking about things that had happened before she could even remember? The possibility of a hidden history, something buried deep within her own life, sent a wave of panic surging through her. Ethan, just tell me, what's going on? Sarah demanded, her frustration mounting. She had been patient, tried to follow the trail, but it was leading her to nothing but more confusion and even less trust. Ethan stood up suddenly, his hands running through his hair in frustration. You're not ready, Sarah. You think you are, but you're not. Her pulse quickened as the tension in the room escalated. What does that even mean? He turned, facing her for the first time in what felt like ages, his eyes dark with something she couldn't read. Fear, maybe. Or was it guilt? Don't open the next letter, he said, his voice low and urgent. It's not what you think. You'll get yourself in deeper than you can imagine. A cold wave washed over Sarah. She knew he wasn't just trying to protect her, he was hiding something, and the fact that he'd just warned her not to open the next letter made her want to do the exact opposite. What was in that letter? What had he been involved in? Ethan's warning only made her more determined. As he stood there, seeming to retreat into his own thoughts, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, was Ethan part of the game? Was he involved in whatever this was? She had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. You can't keep me in the dark forever, Ethan, she said firmly, her voice trembling with the weight of the moment. I'm already in this, and I need to know what's going on. He didn't respond, just looked at her with eyes that seemed to see through her. In that silence, Sarah felt the world shift slightly. Nothing was as it seemed anymore, and the darkness of uncertainty pressed in closer. As she left his apartment that night, the weight of the folder in her hand seemed like a ticking time bomb. What had she just uncovered? What had she walked into? One thing was clear now. Everything she thought she knew was about to be turned upside down. The following days felt like a blur to Sarah. The weight of the letter, the folder, and Ethan's cryptic warning weighed heavily on her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling her, something huge, something that might change everything. She had to know more. There was no going back. It was a rainy afternoon when Sarah finally decided she couldn't wait any longer. The thoughts swirling in her mind were relentless, and she had to confront Ethan. She couldn't let him keep her in the dark. She had to push for answers. She stood at the door of his apartment, her breath catching in her throat as she rang the doorbell. It had been a few days since she'd last seen him, since the folder, since the warning. What if he wouldn't answer? What if he wasn't even there? She had no plan beyond the confrontation. All she had was a burning need for the truth. The door swung open, and there he was, Ethan. His face tightened the moment he saw her standing there, a mix of surprise and something darker lurking in his eyes. For a split second, it felt as though the air between them crackled with tension. "Sarah," Ethan said, his voice soft but guarded. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter without another word. The apartment felt colder than it had before, and the silence was deafening. Sarah had never seen Ethan look so distant, so closed off. His usual easygoing demeanor was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only a strained version of himself, and it only made her more determined to get to the bottom of things. "What's going on, Ethan?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. "You need to tell me the truth. I can't keep pretending like nothing's wrong." Ethan didn't immediately answer. Instead, he walked over to the window, staring out into the rain as if searching for something. Sarah could see the internal battle playing out in his eyes. He was holding something back, something big. "I'm trying to protect you, Sarah," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't want you involved in this." "Protect me," Sarah repeated, the skepticism clear in her tone. "From what? What is this thing you're protecting me from, Ethan?" She could see the hesitation in his posture, the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. It was as though he was trying to find a way to make this easier for her to understand. But how could she possibly understand if he kept withholding the truth? Ethan turned around, finally meeting her gaze. His face was pale, as though he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were tired, bloodshot from too many sleepless nights, too much thinking, too many questions that still didn't have answers. "The letter," Ethan said, his voice strained. "It's not from just anyone. It's from someone. From my past. A past that I thought I had buried. I never wanted you to be dragged into it. I thought I could leave it behind, but now it's back, and it's targeting you." Sarah's heart began to race, her chest tightening with every word he spoke. "What do you mean it's targeting me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan took a step toward her, his hands clenched at his sides, as if he were holding something in. The gravity of his words seemed to weigh him down. "I never told you about my family. My father, he's involved in some dangerous things that I didn't want you to know about. This letter is just the beginning. It's a warning. Whoever's sending these letters, they want something, and I think they want you to be part of it." The truth felt like a punch to Sarah's gut. Ethan had always been so open, so kind. How could he have kept something so monumental from her? The realization hit her like a wave, pulling her under. "So you've been hiding your past all this time?" Sarah's voice cracked with a mixture of hurt and confusion. "You've been keeping me in the dark about this, all this time?" Ethan's face softened as he stepped closer, as though he wanted to reach out to her but didn't know how. "It wasn't like that," he whispered. "I was trying to protect you. You have to understand. My father, he's a dangerous man. I thought I could keep you away from all of this. But now with the letters, it's clear they know about you, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She had always known there was something about Ethan that he wasn't saying, but this was more than she could have ever imagined. "What do they want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked as though he might say something more, but he paused, his face tightening with emotion. "I don't know yet. But whatever it is, it's not something you should be involved in." Sarah's mind raced. She was no longer just a bystander. The truth was out there, and it was more dangerous than she ever could have expected. Ethan's world, his past, had just collided with her present, and now she was caught in the middle. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of their words hanging between them. It was like everything in the room had shifted. The air felt thicker now, more oppressive. The knowledge of what was at stake, what could be coming for them both, was overwhelming. "I have to do something," Sarah finally said, breaking the silence. I can't just sit here and wait for it to come to us. We need to find out who's behind this, who's sending these letters. We need to stop this before it gets worse. Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. Sarah, you don't know what you're asking. This isn't a game. This is real. This is my family's mess, and I've already dragged you into it. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. I'm already in it, Ethan, and I'm not going to run from it, not now. We need to find out who's behind this. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, as though weighing her words. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders sagging with a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. All right, but you need to understand, Sarah, this is dangerous. There's no turning back after this. And so, with a heavy heart and a sense of impending dread, they agreed to take the next step together, not knowing what awaited them, but knowing it could be far more perilous than either of them could have ever imagined. The rain had stopped, but the weight of what had been revealed hung in the air like a storm that wouldn't pass. Sarah felt her world shifting beneath her feet. She wasn't the same person she'd been just days ago, innocent, unaware. She'd been thrust into a world she didn't understand, and she couldn't just walk away from it now. The letter, the mystery, Ethan's dangerous past, it was all tied together, and there was no escaping it. They spent the next few days trying to piece together the information in the letter, working side by side, trying to find the one key that could unravel the whole mystery. Ethan's mood had shifted too. Where he had been trying to protect Sarah, he now seemed equally desperate and determined. His family's secret was out, and now there was no going back. The two of them were in this together. But neither of them had any idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. The letter had mentioned a name Sarah had never heard before, a name that had a weight to it, like a warning. Victor Carver. Who is he? Sarah asked, staring at the name written in neat, precise handwriting on the letter. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darkening. He had been avoiding talking about Victor, but Sarah wasn't going to let him off the hook. She had to know. Victor Carver is my father's right hand, Ethan muttered, his voice tight. He's been involved in everything. Money laundering, underground deals, you name it. He's ruthless, and he's always looking for leverage. That's why I kept my distance from all of this. Sarah frowned. But if he's so dangerous, why would he send us this letter? Why does he want me involved? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he paced across the room, as though the weight of the question was suffocating him. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't make sense of it himself. But he knew that once Victor was involved, nothing was simple. Not even the most innocent of situations could stay untouched by Victor's reach. We need to find him, Sarah said, her voice resolute. We need to find out what he wants and why he's targeting me. Ethan met her eyes, a mixture of worry and admiration flashing across his face. He knew Sarah was strong, but this was a level of danger neither of them had ever faced. Are you sure you want to do this, Sarah? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't know what you're walking into. I don't care, she replied, her voice steady. I'm already in this. I can't go back now. Ethan let out a breath, glancing at the door like he was already preparing to step into a fight. He knew they might not win. All right then, let's find him. But we have to be smart about this. The search for Victor Carver led them down a path neither of them was prepared for. Late-night meetings in back alleys, shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their world. Ethan's past wasn't just something that could be put behind them. It was a living, breathing thing that had now come to collect what it was owed. The first clue came a few days later when Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. You're getting close, the voice said, a low chuckle following. Too close for comfort. I suggest you stop. You don't want to know what happens when you keep digging. The line went dead before Sarah could respond, her heart racing. She looked over at Ethan, who had been listening in the other room. He had heard the warning too, and he was just as shaken as she was. This is it, Sarah said, her voice filled with resolve. They're trying to stop us, but we can't stop now. We need to push forward. Ethan nodded slowly. I know. We're already in too deep. But deep down, they both knew the risks. They had already been warned, yet, as the days passed, they couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's hand was just waiting to strike. They had to stay one step ahead. The next few days were a blur of frantic searching, but it wasn't until a chance encounter that the pieces began to fall into place. Sarah and Ethan had tracked down a lead that had brought them to a small, nondescript diner on the outskirts of town. They weren't sure what they were expecting. Maybe an informant, maybe someone who could point them in the right direction, but they weren't prepared for what they found. Victor Carver's men were already there. As Sarah and Ethan stepped into the diner, the atmosphere shifted. The air became thick with tension, the smell of coffee and greasy food mixing with a sudden sense of danger. The men sat in the corner booth, their eyes flicking over to Sarah and Ethan as soon as they entered. One of them stood up, his face impassive as he approached them. I think it's time you left, he said quietly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Ethan's body tensed, but he didn't flinch. We're not going anywhere. We're looking for answers, and we're not stopping until we get them. The man's lips curled into a cold smile. You don't understand, do you? He murmured. You don't get to ask questions. Not anymore. And with that, the tension in the room snapped. What followed was a blur. Chaos, as Ethan and Sarah found themselves running for their lives. Victor Carver's men weren't going to let them walk away. Not now, not ever. They barely escaped the diner with their lives. The adrenaline was still coursing through Sarah's veins as they stumbled into the safety of the car, barely breathing. Are you okay? Ethan asked, his voice shaky. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out the window, trying to process everything that had just happened. The threat was real. They were in deeper than they had ever imagined. We have to keep moving, she said quietly. We can't stop now. Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. He could see the determination in her eyes. He had known Sarah was strong, but seeing her face the danger head-on like this made him admire her even more. Together, they drove into the night, the road ahead uncertain and dangerous. The chase had begun, and there was no turning back. They had crossed the point of no return, and all they could do now was hope they could stay one step ahead of Victor Carver. The days blurred into one another as Sarah and Ethan continued their pursuit of answers, the tension mounting with each passing hour. They had barely escaped the clutches of Victor Carver's men, and their lives were now in constant danger. But neither of them was ready to back down. The truth had already started to unravel, and they both knew there was no turning back. They couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Every phone call felt like an interception, every shadow a possible threat. Their every move was calculated, and the more they tried to uncover, the deeper the trap seemed to be closing in around them. It wasn't until Sarah received another anonymous message that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The message, sent from a private email address, was short and cryptic but carried an undeniable weight. Meet me at the old warehouse, midnight. If you want the truth, you have no choice but to come. No name, no sign-off, just the words that hung in the air like an omen. Ethan was immediately suspicious. We can't just walk into a trap like that, he said, pacing the floor as Sarah stared at the screen of her phone. We don't have a choice, Sarah replied, her voice hardening with resolve. If they want us to come, they're expecting us. That means we might finally get the answers we need. But even as she said it, a knot formed in her stomach. The danger was real. They were walking into a lion's den, and neither of them was naive enough to think they wouldn't pay the price. The old warehouse was on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes, where the city's noise couldn't reach them. When they arrived at the location, the place looked abandoned, decay hanging in the air, windows boarded up and graffiti covering the walls. No signs of life, no sounds. It was as if the world had forgotten this place existed. "This is it," Sarah whispered, as she glanced around, her heart racing. "It's too quiet." Ethan's eyes darted nervously across the darkened alley, sensing the same unease. But Sarah was already moving, her hand gripping the cold metal of the warehouse door. She pushed it open cautiously, her breath catching in her throat as they stepped into the darkness beyond. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit by a single flickering light hanging overhead. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old wood and steel heavy in the stale atmosphere. It felt abandoned, empty, except for the shadows that seemed to watch them from every corner. "We're not alone," Ethan muttered, his voice low, barely audible. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, even though no one was there. "Stay close," Sarah replied, her voice steady, though her grip on Ethan's hand tightened. They both knew that danger was imminent, but they also knew that they couldn't back down now. They moved cautiously through the shadows, their footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. They hadn't gone far before they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere in the warehouse, footsteps that were far too deliberate to be accidental. Without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light. He was tall, wearing a long coat, his face partially obscured by the hood he wore. He didn't speak at first, just watched them intently with cold, calculating eyes. His presence alone seemed to send a chill through the room. Sarah's pulse quickened. She could sense that this was the moment, the turning point where the game they were playing would go from dangerous to deadly. "You wanted the truth," the man said finally, his voice smooth and calculated. "And now you'll get it. But I suggest you listen closely, because what you learn tonight will change everything." Ethan stepped forward, his jaw clenched, but his voice was controlled. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he raised a hand and gestured to the shadows behind him. Slowly, the darkness began to shift, and Sarah's breath caught as more figures emerged from the corners of the room. One by one, they revealed themselves. Victor Carver's men, all armed and poised, surrounding them. "We've been waiting for you," the man said, "for both of you." A cold sweat dripped down Sarah's spine as she realized the truth. They had been walking into a carefully constructed trap from the start. Every step they had taken, every clue they had followed, had led them straight into the web Victor Carver had spun for them. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "You sent the letter. Why? What do you want from us?" The man's lips curled into a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "It's simple. You've been digging too deep. And now you know things you shouldn't know. The truth, Sarah. It's dangerous." Ethan gripped her arm protectively, his eyes scanning the room for any potential way out. "We're not leaving here without answers." The man chuckled darkly, taking a slow step forward. "You don't get to decide that anymore. Your search for the truth has already set things in motion. Now you have no choice but to face the consequences." Ethan's expression hardened. "We're not afraid of you. We'll find a way out of this." The man laughed again, a low, hollow sound. "You think you're in control? You think you can escape the consequences of what you've uncovered? No one escapes Victor Carver." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She was terrified, yes, but she was also furious. She wasn't about to let Victor and his men intimidate her any longer. They'd pushed her into a corner, but she wouldn't let fear dictate her next move. She wouldn't let them win. Just as the tension was at its peak, another voice rang out from the darkness. a voice Sarah recognized all too well. "Stop!" Ethan and Sarah both froze, their eyes darting to the figure standing at the far end of the room, a figure that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. It was Ethan's father. Ethan sat in his room, the harsh light of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His mind was racing, every thought tangled, every piece of the puzzle slipping further from his grasp. The letter in his hand felt heavy, like an anchor pulling him down into an ocean of confusion. He had studied it so many times, trying to decode its message, yet each time it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. But something had changed. There was a shift in his perception, a quiet realization that had been gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah knew more than she was letting on. Every conversation they had, every fleeting look exchanged with her, seemed to hold weight now, as if she was subtly guiding him towards some truth he wasn't ready to face. It was almost as if she was hiding something, maybe even protecting him from it. The weight of suspicion was settling in his chest, and it wasn't easy to bear. Sarah had always been his closest ally, the one person who understood him more than anyone else. But now, as the secrets unfolded and the truth seemed even further away, Ethan was forced to question everything, every look, every word. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. The ringing tone echoed in his ear, and with each ring, his heart rate increased, the anxiety building in his throat. What would he even say? "Do you know more than you're telling me?" It sounded so absurd, but the questions were there, bubbling beneath the surface. Finally, she picked up. "Ethan, what's wrong?" Sarah's voice was steady, calm, but there was a hint of concern. It didn't feel natural, and that made him even more suspicious. She always seemed to know when something was off. I don't know. I just feel like something's not right. The letter and everything that's happening, it's all getting worse. I keep thinking about the things you've said, the things you've done. It's like you're hiding something from me." A long pause stretched between them, the silence thick with tension. Ethan could almost hear Sarah's thoughts racing, her hesitation before responding. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Ethan, I'm just as lost as you are. But we need to trust each other, okay? Everything happening right now, it's bigger than we realize, and we don't have all the answers yet." Ethan clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up inside him. Trust. Was that what this was about? He didn't know what to trust anymore. The doubts were taking root, feeding off every word, every gesture. The girl he had confided in, the one who had always been his rock, now felt like a stranger. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he muttered. I don't know." As the call ended, Ethan stared out the window into the darkening sky. A storm was coming, not just in the weather, but in his life. The questions that had started as a whisper were now screaming for answers, but the path ahead was murky, filled with shadows and uncertainty. Ethan knew he had to keep going, but with every step, the truth felt farther and farther away. And Sarah, was she really his ally? Or was she part of the storm? Ethan sat alone in the dimly lit room, his mind racing. The walls, which once felt comforting, now seemed to close in on him. He stared at the envelope in front of him, the same one that had started this entire journey. The anonymous letter had promised answers, but what it had given him instead was a tangled web of confusion, betrayal, and uncertainty. He glanced at his phone again, the one line of text from Sarah still glaring back at him. "We need to talk. Come over now. It's important." She'd sent it hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to call her. His emotions were too raw, too unpredictable. There was so much he wanted to say to her, but he wasn't sure where to begin. How could he even begin to understand what was happening? The truth, it seemed, was always just out of reach, slipping through his fingers the moment he thought he had it. Ethan had been following the clues for days now, tapping into every piece of information he could find, every lead he could chase. And yet, despite everything he'd uncovered, he felt no closer to knowing the full story. If anything, the pieces of the puzzle had become more fragmented, more distorted. What had started as a simple question, why did Sarah seem so distant, so preoccupied, had evolved into something far more sinister. He had learned things about her, about the people she had been associated with, that he never could have imagined. The letter had hinted at it all. The involvement of Victor Carver, a name he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the letter had been right. The things it had predicted, the threats it had hinted at, they were all coming true. He had questioned Sarah's motives before. Her late-night phone calls, her strange behavior, the unexplained trips she'd been taking, all of it had seemed off. But Ethan had always trusted her, had always thought that whatever was going on, she would tell him. That's what partners did, didn't they? They confided in each other, but now the silence between them was deafening. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up his phone and dialed her number. The seconds felt like hours as he listened to the ringing tone on the other end. Finally, she answered. "Ethan?" Her voice was strained, quieter than usual. "Sarah, we need to talk. Now." He could feel her hesitation, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. "I know, Ethan, but it's not what you think. Please, just..." "Sarah, don't. Just tell me the truth. All of it. No more lies, no more secrets. I can't keep doing this." There was a long pause. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, as if she were weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. It's bigger than you think. There's so much more at play here. I'm not the person you think I am." Ethan's heart sank. The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. He had known this conversation would happen, but hearing it out loud was a different experience entirely. Sarah, the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with everything, was telling him that she wasn't who he thought she was. "I don't know what's happening, but I need you to trust me," she continued. "Meet me at the usual place. I'll explain everything." Ethan's stomach twisted. The usual place. That was where they had shared some of their most intimate moments, the place that had once been their sanctuary. But now it felt like a trap, like the place where everything would unravel, where the truth would finally be revealed. He didn't hesitate. "Fine, I'm coming." As he hung up the phone, a chill ran down his spine. The calm that had settled over him was now replaced with an uneasy dread. The conversation had only raised more questions. What had she meant when she said it was bigger than he thought? What was she hiding? As Ethan made his way out of the apartment, the night air felt colder than usual, as if it were warning him of the storm that was about to hit. He couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to collapse. Everything he knew, everything he believed about Sarah, would come crashing down. With each step, the tension inside him grew. He had no idea what to expect when he saw Sarah, but one thing was clear. The truth was finally within reach. Ethan arrived at the cafe a few minutes earlier than expected, the familiar sounds of the city ringing in his ears as he walked through the quiet streets. The bustling noise of the world felt distant now, like it no longer mattered. All that mattered was this moment, the meeting with Sarah that could either tear everything apart or finally give him the closure he desperately needed. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a couple of people hunched over their laptops. The soft hum of the espresso machine was a comfort in the midst of the chaos in his mind. Ethan stood by the entrance waiting, his foot tapping nervously. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:03 p.m. She was late. His anxiety grew, but he tried to push it down. She's probably just running behind. Maybe she's nervous too, he told himself. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a simple conversation. There was more at play here. He could feel it in his gut. As if on cue, the door opened, and Sarah stepped inside, her presence instantly recognizable despite the heavy coat she was wearing. She looked just as he remembered, beautiful, yet distant. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, as though she hadn't slept in days. "Sarah," Ethan whispered as she approached, barely finding the strength to speak her name. She offered him a small, shaky smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a weariness in her gaze, something hidden beneath the surface, a secret she was struggling to keep. "Ethan," she said softly, taking a seat across from him. She didn't look him in the eye, instead focusing on the cup of coffee in front of her. Her fingers twisted around the ceramic mug, the motion making her seem fragile, vulnerable. "I didn't want you to find out this way." Her voice trembled, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might start crying. But then, she seemed to pull herself together, as if holding onto some invisible thread that kept her from breaking. Ethan's chest tightened. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating him. Find out what? He wanted to scream. "What the hell are you hiding from me, Sarah?" He clenched his fists under the table, trying to stay calm. He needed answers, not more vague statements. "Then what are you hiding?" he asked, his voice shaking with frustration. "What's going on, Sarah? Why didn't you tell me? Why all the secrecy?" Her gaze flicked to his, and for a moment their eyes locked. In that brief instant, Ethan could see something in her eyes, guilt, fear, regret. But there was something else, something darker lurking beneath it all. It was like she was fighting with herself, trying to decide whether to tell him the truth or keep him in the dark. "I never wanted to hurt you," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't have a choice. I was forced into this." Ethan leaned forward, his heart racing. "What do you mean? What do you mean you were forced?" Sarah took a deep breath, looking around the cafe as though she were checking to see if anyone was listening. The tension between them was so thick, it felt like the walls were closing in. She lowered her voice. "There's someone else involved in all of this, Ethan, someone dangerous. I tried to protect you from it, but it's too late now. You're already involved." Ethan felt a chill run through his veins, his mind struggling to keep up with her words. Someone dangerous. He could barely wrap his head around what she was saying. He had always thought of their life together as simple, as normal as it could be, but now it was all crumbling away in an instant. "Who? Who are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising. Sarah glanced over her shoulder again before leaning in closer to him, her face pale and drawn. "It's Victor Carver. He's the one behind everything." The name hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. He had heard the name before, but it was always whispered, always accompanied by fear and suspicion. Victor Carver was a figure in the shadows, dangerous, influential, and ruthless. But why would Sarah be involved with him? How had she become entangled in this mess? Ethan's mind raced as he processed her words. There had been so many things he hadn't understood. Sarah's strange behavior, the late-night meetings, her reluctance to talk about her past. It all made sense now. She was caught in a trap, but why hadn't she told him sooner? "Why didn't you tell me this earlier, Sarah?" Ethan asked, his voice softer now, but still edged with pain. "Why keep it from me?" Sarah's hands trembled as she held her mug, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. She closed her eyes, as if gathering the strength to explain everything. "I couldn't. I thought if I kept you in the dark, I could protect you. I thought it was safer that way." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to scream at her, to shake her and demand answers, but instead he sat there in silence, trying to process everything she had just said. Victor Carver, the man behind it all, the man who had somehow woven himself into the fabric of Sarah's life, pulling her strings like a puppet master. Ethan could barely comprehend the depth of the situation. As the silence grew between them, Sarah finally spoke again, her voice breaking the stillness. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I never wanted you to be part of this. But now it's too late." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Ethan sat frozen, the words Sarah had just uttered echoing in his mind. Victor Carver. The name hit him like a blow to the chest, knocking the breath out of him. The pieces that had once seemed scattered and unclear were starting to form a terrifying picture. Sarah had kept secrets from him, secrets that now seemed to have dangerous implications. "You're telling me that everything we've been through was a lie?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. The room felt too small, as if the walls were closing in on him. His thoughts were racing, but his mind struggled to keep up with the gravity of what was happening. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment she looked like the woman he had once loved, the woman he thought he knew. But in the next second, the mask slipped. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Ethan felt a pang of betrayal so sharp, it was almost physical. "I never wanted it to be this way," she whispered. "I swear, Ethan, I never did. But I didn't have a choice. Victor doesn't give you a choice." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. He had never imagined something like this. Sarah, the woman he trusted, the woman he thought he knew inside and out, tangled up with a criminal like Victor Carver. "What do you mean? You didn't have a choice? Were you involved with him willingly?" Ethan's voice cracked, and he had to fight to keep the anger from bubbling to the surface. Sarah shook her head, tears slipping down her face. "Number. It wasn't like that. I didn't know who he was at first. But then I got caught up in it. And by the time I realized what he was capable of, it was too late. I was already in too deep." Ethan's heart broke at her words. He wanted to believe her, to understand how she had gotten herself into this mess. But the truth felt too distant, too far out of reach. How had someone like Sarah, someone he had shared so many moments with, become entangled in this world? But how? How did it all start? Ethan's voice trembled with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "How did you go from being the woman I knew to this?" Sarah took a deep breath and wiped the tears from her eyes. "It started small. At first it was just business, nothing serious, but Victor, he's dangerous, Ethan. He gets inside your head, makes you think you owe him something. And before you know it, you're doing things you never thought you would." Ethan's mind flashed back to the subtle signs he had missed, the late nights when Sarah would disappear, the strange phone calls she'd get in the middle of the night, the times she seemed distant, distracted, and troubled. He had noticed, of course. He had tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress or work. But now he realized it had been something much darker. "You didn't tell me because you didn't want me involved," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to Sarah. "You didn't want me to know the truth." She nodded, her voice barely audible. "I thought if I kept you in the dark, I could protect you. I didn't want you to get hurt. Victor doesn't play by the rules, and if he found out you knew, I couldn't let that happen." Ethan shook his head, a cold fury bubbling beneath the surface. "You think hiding this from me protected me? You think keeping me out of it kept me safe? I'm already involved, Sarah. I'm already involved." His words hit her like a slap. She recoiled slightly, her face crumpling with regret. She looked at him as if searching for some kind of forgiveness that he wasn't ready to give. "I never meant to put you in danger," she whispered, "but now I don't know how to get us out of it." Victor is relentless, Ethan. If he thinks you're a threat, if he thinks you know too much, he won't stop until you're gone. The weight of her words settled over him like a storm cloud. Ethan's thoughts were swirling, his mind struggling to process what she had just revealed. It was no longer just a matter of betrayal. It was a matter of survival. And in that moment, he realized that he had no choice but to confront the darkness head on. "We need to leave. We need to get away from here," Ethan said, his voice firm, his mind made up. Victor Carver, he's not just some businessman. He's dangerous. And we need to get out of his reach before it's too late. Sarah's eyes widened. "You don't understand," she said quickly. "Leaving won't help. He'll find us. You can't run from someone like Victor. He has eyes everywhere. There's no escape." Ethan stood up, shaking his head. "Then we'll fight back." Sarah looked up at him, a mixture of disbelief and fear in her eyes. "Fight back?" she repeated, her voice shaky. "Ethan, you don't know what you're asking. You don't know who he is." Ethan locked eyes with her, his jaw set. "I'm not afraid of him. I've been afraid for too long. It's time to put an end to this." The determination in his voice was undeniable. It was the first time since hearing her confession that he felt a glimmer of hope. There was a way out. There had to be. But Sarah didn't look convinced. "You're walking into a trap, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Victor will destroy you. He will destroy everything." Ethan clenched his fists. "Not if we take the first step." Ethan paced back and forth in their small, dimly lit living room, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts and plans. His heart raced as he struggled to think through their next move. Sarah, sitting silently on the couch, watched him, her face drawn with worry, her eyes clouded with doubt. Ethan's mind was focused. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They couldn't sit back any longer, hoping Victor would somehow leave them alone. The danger was too real, too close. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me," Ethan said, stopping abruptly in front of her. "We need to do something now. If we wait any longer, it'll be too late. We can't keep running forever. We need to make sure Victor understands that we're not going to be his victims anymore." Sarah flinched, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Ethan, I don't know if you fully understand. Victor doesn't just let things go. If we make a move against him, it'll be a war, and we'll lose." Ethan's jaw tightened, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He had known she was scared, but he hadn't realized just how deep her fear ran. Victor Carver wasn't just a man. They were up against a system, a network that could crush them without a second thought. But Ethan wasn't about to back down. "I get it. He's dangerous. But the longer we wait, the more control he has over us. He already has us in a vice grip, Sarah. I'm done being afraid. We have to fight back, and we need to do it smartly. We need a plan." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her gaze flickering to the door as if she expected someone to come barging through it at any moment. "What kind of plan are you talking about?" Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He knew there was no easy way to do this. They couldn't just confront Victor head on, not without a plan. But there had to be a way to turn the tables. They had to outsmart him, use his own arrogance against him, and the more Ethan thought about it, the clearer the path became. "We need to expose him," he said finally, his voice firm, though his pulse still hammered in his chest. "We need to take him down from the inside. We gather evidence, we dig deep, we find his weaknesses, and we use it against him. The moment he realizes we're a threat, we hit him hard. We force him to back off." Sarah looked at him, her expression filled with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "You think that'll work? You think you can expose a man like him? He's untouchable. He's got people everywhere. He's already one step ahead of us." Ethan nodded, his gaze intense. "That's exactly why we need to be 2 steps ahead. If we do this right, he'll never see it coming." "But how?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "How are we supposed to get close enough to gather evidence? We don't even know where to start." Ethan rubbed his hands over his face, trying to calm his racing thoughts. We start with what we know. We go through everything we have, everything we've seen and heard. We need to dig through Victor's connections, his allies, and see where the cracks are. There's always a crack, Sarah. There's always a way in. We just have to find it. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to decide whether to trust him completely. "And what then?" she asked quietly. "What do we do once we have what we need?" "Victor isn't the kind of man you just call the cops on. He'll make sure we disappear before we even get the chance." Ethan took a step closer to her, determination burning in his eyes. "Once we have the proof, we take it to the right people. We use the information to destroy him. We go public, we go to the media, we use whatever leverage we have to make sure he has no way of coming after us again. We bring him down, Sarah. We end this." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fear and anticipation. Ethan could see the doubt in Sarah's eyes, but he also saw the faintest glimmer of hope. A flicker of the woman he once knew, the woman who was willing to fight. "I'm in," Sarah said quietly, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "But we need to be careful. If we do this, there's no turning back. We can't afford to make a mistake." Ethan nodded. He knew it was a risk, but what other choice did they have? He was ready to fight for their freedom, for their lives, no matter the cost. "We won't make a mistake," he said. "We'll do it right. We'll make sure Victor pays for everything he's done." Ethan and Sarah sat at the old wooden table in the dimly lit living room. The weight of the task ahead hung heavily in the air. Every second that passed felt like a ticking clock, as if time itself was closing in around them. Ethan's fingers tapped rhythmically against the wood as he stared at the piles of paperwork, old receipts, and documents that had been collected over the years. Each piece seemed like a potential clue, but they had to figure out how to make sense of it all. "We're running out of time," Ethan said quietly, the edge in his voice betraying the growing pressure on him. "If we wait much longer, Victor will have us right where he wants us." Sarah sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her expression was tight with anxiety, and her mind was racing. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how do we even start? We don't know where to look. We don't know who to trust." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. He thought of everything they'd been through so far. Victor's relentless grip on their lives, his power, and his vast connections. They couldn't afford to make a single misstep. One wrong move and it could all come crashing down on them. He glanced at the pile of documents again, trying to find something, anything, that could point them in the right direction. His eyes lingered on a specific envelope, one he hadn't noticed before. It was worn with a frayed edge and had a cryptic address written on the front. "Sarah, take a look at this," Ethan said, his voice laced with urgency. Sarah's gaze followed his finger as it pointed to the envelope. She raised an eyebrow in confusion. "What is it?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He carefully picked up the envelope and slowly slid the paper out. It was a single sheet of paper, but the words on it were enough to make his heart race. There was an address, an office building in the city, but no name, just a string of numbers that looked like some kind of code. "This could be it," Ethan muttered. "It's the first real lead we've gotten. Whoever is behind this, they're connected to Victor." Sarah stood up, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. "What are we waiting for then? Let's go. We don't have time to waste." Ethan shook his head, a cautious look in his eyes. We can't just rush in. We need to plan this carefully. We don't know who we're dealing with. If we mess this up, then what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising with frustration. "You think we're going to get a second chance? If we wait any longer, Victor will know exactly what we're up to. We have no choice but to act now." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his thoughts. He could feel the weight of Sarah's words. She was right. Every moment they delayed was another chance for Victor to tighten his grip on them, but he needed to think things through. Rushing in would only get them in trouble. "We'll go," he said finally, "but we do it my way. No mistakes." Sarah nodded. Her jaw clenched tightly. She knew better than to argue. Ethan's mind was already turning, planning their next move. He knew they had to move fast, but they had to be smart about it. One wrong move, and everything they'd worked for would be for nothing. They gathered their things. Sarah took a deep breath as she stuffed the envelope into her bag and prepared to leave. It was time to confront the beast lurking in the shadows, and this was just the beginning. The night was dark, with only the hum of distant streetlights cutting through the silence. Ethan and Sarah moved swiftly through the deserted city streets, their footsteps echoing in the empty air. Their destination was close, an office building that, according to the address, seemed to be the key to unraveling the mystery surrounding Victor Carver. Sarah walked a little faster, her mind buzzing with uncertainty. "Do you really think this is going to lead us to something big?" she asked, her voice barely audible as she kept pace with Ethan. Ethan didn't look at her, his eyes focused ahead. "I don't know, but it's the only lead we've got. We have to follow it." They reached the building, a tall, nondescript structure that loomed in the shadows. Its exterior was plain, almost forgettable, just another office block among many in the city. But to them, it felt like a door to something far more dangerous, a door they had no choice but to open. Ethan scanned the entrance carefully. The lobby was dimly lit, with a security guard at a desk near the elevators. The guard barely glanced at them as they entered, and they kept walking, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. They reached the elevator, and Ethan pressed the button for the top floor. As the doors slid shut, he glanced at Sarah. "We don't know who or what we'll find up there. Stay alert." "I'm ready," Sarah replied, her voice steady but her grip tightening around her purse. She wasn't sure if she was trying to steady her nerves or if it was just the weight of what they were about to do. Either way, the fear was there, pounding in her chest with each passing moment. The elevator hummed its way up, and Ethan felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He had no idea what they'd find at the top, but the closer they got, the more his instincts screamed that they were walking into something they couldn't control. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about survival. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a long hallway. The floor was lined with small office doors, most of them closed, but one was slightly ajar. A faint light escaped from the crack. Ethan motioned for Sarah to follow him, and they approached the door carefully, moving silently. "Do you think someone's in there?" Sarah whispered, her breath shaky. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for her to stay back, and he crept closer to the door. He peered inside, his heart racing. The room was a small office, nothing extravagant. But the man sitting behind the desk was unmistakable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the man instantly, Victor Carver's right-hand man, Paul Bradford. Paul was the one who had helped cover up so many of Victor's darkest secrets. Ethan had seen him in passing at the company headquarters, always lurking in the background, watching like a hawk. Ethan's mind raced. This was the break they needed. Paul could lead them directly to Victor. But how were they going to get close without being detected? Ethan's hand clenched into a fist as he weighed his options. He glanced back at Sarah, who was standing a few feet behind him, eyes wide with anxiety. Her fingers twitched, as if she, too, was processing the implications of this discovery. She was ready. But was Ethan? "Stay behind me," he whispered, making his decision. He slowly pushed the door open, just enough to slip inside without being noticed. The door creaked open just enough to allow Ethan and Sarah to slip inside the dimly lit office. The air was thick with tension, and every small noise seemed magnified in the quiet room. Paul Bradford sat behind a large polished desk, his back to them, staring out the window. He had yet to notice their presence, but his posture was rigid, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Ethan motioned for Sarah to stay still, his own body frozen in place as he surveyed the scene. The faint glow of city lights filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. On the desk, a few papers were scattered haphazardly, some of them bearing the unmistakable logo of Victor Carver's company. Ethan's heart raced. This was the man who could reveal everything: Victor's secrets, his plans, and perhaps even the truth behind the mysterious letter that had set everything into motion. But getting Paul to talk wasn't going to be easy. The man had always been cold and calculating, never one to reveal his hand. With careful precision, Ethan took a step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The sound made Paul's shoulders stiffen, and he slowly turned his head toward the noise, his eyes narrowing when he saw Ethan standing there. "Mr. Bradford," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "We need to talk." Paul's expression remained neutral, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition. He knew who Ethan was, knew that he had come for answers, but instead of showing fear or surprise, Paul simply leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk forming on his lips. "Ethan Hayes," Paul said coolly, "I've been expecting you." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. How could he have known? They had just arrived, and they had been careful. No one should have known they were here. But Paul's calm demeanor told him one thing. This was no coincidence. They had walked right into a trap. "What do you want from us?" Sarah asked, her voice firm as she stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated. She wasn't afraid of Paul Bradford, not when she knew how much was at stake. Paul's smirk widened, and he tilted his head. "Want? I don't want anything from you. You're the ones who came looking for answers, aren't you?" His eyes shifted between Ethan and Sarah, studying them carefully. "But I have to admit, I'm curious. What makes you think you can expose Victor Carver's secrets? You're in way over your heads." Ethan's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. The conversation could go in any direction now. He couldn't afford to let Paul get the upper hand. "We're not backing down," Ethan said, stepping closer. "We know what you're hiding. We know about the illegal operations, the manipulation, the lies. It's all coming to an end, Paul, and you're going to help us stop Victor." Paul laughed, a low, amused sound that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "You think you can stop him? Victor is untouchable. He's always 3 steps ahead of everyone, including you too." The smugness in Paul's voice only fueled Ethan's determination. He wasn't going to let this man belittle their efforts. He wasn't going to let Victor win. "We don't need to stop him alone," Ethan replied, his voice sharp. "You're going to help us take him down, Paul, one way or another." For a moment there was silence in the room. Paul didn't speak, didn't move, but the air seemed to thicken as the weight of the words hung between them. Ethan's grip tightened on the edge of the desk, his mind racing. "I can't do that," Paul finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was quieter now, tinged with something almost like regret. "It's too late. Victor's plans are already in motion. There's no turning back." Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Then tell us what we need to know, Paul. Tell us how we can stop him." Paul's gaze shifted toward the window, his eyes distant as if lost in thought. After a long, tense pause, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "You think you can stop a man like Victor with a few questions and a little bit of leverage? It's not that simple. You're out of your depth." But before Paul could say more, a sudden sound broke through the tension, footsteps approaching from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of someone moving quickly, purposefully. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't ready for this. They weren't ready for this. Paul's expression flickered with something darker, something dangerous. "Get ready," Paul whispered, his voice low. "You're about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole goes." The door to the office slammed open just as Paul's words hung in the air. Two figures stepped inside, tall and imposing. Ethan's breath caught as they locked eyes. It was too late to run. The two figures that had entered the room were dressed in black suits, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses. Their presence was overpowering, and the atmosphere in the office seemed to shift with their arrival, a palpable shift from tension to something darker. Ethan and Sarah instinctively moved closer to each other, knowing that the stakes had just been raised. "Who are they?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, her body taut with the instinctive fear that gripped her. She could feel her heart pounding, her breath short, as if something terrible was about to unfold. Paul's smirk was gone now, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. He stood from his desk slowly, his posture rigid, as if expecting these men. Ethan and Sarah exchanged a glance, both trying to gauge the situation, but neither was prepared for what was happening. "They're his people," Paul said, his tone lacking the confidence it had earlier. He was no longer in control of the situation, and the realization sent a chill through Ethan's veins. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward. His eyes swept over Ethan and Sarah, sizing them up with clinical precision. There was no recognition, no acknowledgement of who they were. Only a cold, empty stare. The other man remained by the door, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, a silent sentinel. "Ethan Hayes," the man spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "And Sarah Morgan, you've come a long way to find answers, but you've walked into a situation far more dangerous than you could ever imagine." Ethan didn't flinch, though his mind raced. They knew their names, which meant they'd been followed. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. The man's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "We work for someone who values discretion, something you've clearly overlooked." He tilted his head slightly as if savoring the moment. Victor Carver doesn't like being hunted, and when you dig into someone like him, you dig your own grave. The words hit Ethan hard, but it was the coldness in the man's voice that sent a shiver through his spine. The entire situation felt like a trap, one they'd unknowingly walked into. There was no way out now, no more easy answers. "We're not afraid of him," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. She stepped forward, her eyes locking with the man's. "We're not backing down. We're getting the truth." The man chuckled darkly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. "Courage is admirable, but it won't save you." He glanced at Paul, who seemed to shrink back, unable or unwilling to intervene. Ethan's pulse quickened and his mind raced. They couldn't let this go any further. The danger was real, and they had to act quickly before they were completely trapped. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was an ambush. But how could they possibly escape? How could they hope to take on Victor Carver's operation, which seemed to have eyes and ears everywhere? "Tell me what you want," Ethan demanded, his voice rising with a sudden burst of frustration. "We're not leaving without answers, so either you start talking or things will get worse for all of us." The man didn't react immediately. Instead, he just stood there observing, sizing them up. It was as if they were pawns in a larger game, a game he was already several moves ahead in. Finally, he spoke again, his voice cold, almost condescending. "You think you can just waltz in and demand answers, don't you? You have no idea what you're up against, but you will, soon enough." The truth isn't something you can just find by asking questions. It's buried, hidden, and if you keep digging, you'll uncover things that were never meant to see the light of day. It won't just destroy Victor, it will destroy you too. The ominous words lingered in the air, thick with the weight of impending danger. Ethan and Sarah exchanged a look, both understanding that they had no choice now but to continue, no matter the cost. "We're not afraid of what's buried," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "We're here to bring it to light." The man's expression flickered briefly, a subtle shift that hinted at something deeper, something more dangerous than they could comprehend. For the first time, he looked intrigued. "Well then," he said, stepping back towards the door, "you've been warned. But if you're truly committed to this path, you'll need more than courage, you'll need power, and you'll need to be prepared for what comes next." He turned to his companion at the door. "Take them to Victor." The room felt colder as the two men, the silent figures in black suits, guided Ethan and Sarah through the dimly lit hallway. Their footsteps echoed, a constant reminder of how isolated they were in this place, cut off from the world outside. The intensity of the moment was overwhelming, and yet a strange calm had washed over Ethan. His heart still pounded, but his mind was clearer now, focused on one singular goal: Victor Carver. As they moved through the labyrinthine corridors, every corner seemed to lead them further into the unknown. The walls, adorned with stark, minimalist art, held no comfort. The silence between them was suffocating, but Sarah walked beside him, her presence grounding him in this disorienting reality. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a heavy steel door. One of the men knocked twice, and the other turned to face Ethan and Sarah. "This is where it ends for you," he said quietly, his voice cold but not unkind. "Once that door opens, there's no turning back. You won't find the truth in the way you think you will." Ethan met the man's eyes, unwilling to let fear or doubt creep in. "I don't care what's waiting. I came here for answers." The man didn't respond immediately, but gave a slight nod before stepping aside. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. It was sparse, with a single desk sitting in the center, and behind it, the silhouette of a man sitting with his back to them, Victor Carver. His figure was imposing, even in the darkness, a man whose presence seemed to fill the room before his words even did. The air grew thicker as they stepped in, and a sense of dread settled over Ethan. They had finally come face to face with the person responsible for everything. Without turning around, Victor's voice sliced through the silence. "I've been expecting you," he said. His tone was smooth, yet there was an edge to it that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. "I knew you would come. You always do, don't you? Curious, relentless, looking for something you can't understand." Ethan swallowed hard, but didn't back down. "I'm not here for games, Carver. I'm here for the truth." Victor slowly turned around in his chair, revealing a face that was both familiar and foreign to Ethan. There was something unsettlingly magnetic about him. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but not in the way Ethan had expected. This wasn't the face of a monster, but of someone who had built a life around carefully crafted illusions. "You don't even know what you're asking for," Victor said, his voice low but firm. "The truth is not something that can be simply handed over. It's something you have to earn, and in your case, it will cost you more than you realize." Ethan's pulse quickened, and he couldn't suppress the anger that bubbled up inside him. "You don't scare me. All I want is the truth about my brother, about what you did." Victor smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, the family angle. How sweet. Your brother, he was a part of something much bigger than you realize. And now you want to dig into a past that's better left buried." Sarah, who had been silently standing by Ethan's side, stepped forward. "We're not leaving," until you tell us everything. About him, about what happened, about all of it." Victor's eyes flicked to her, and there was a brief moment where it almost seemed like he was considering her words. But then, the smile returned. "You both have so much to learn, but you'll find that out soon enough." There was a tense silence that stretched on, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The stakes were higher now, but what did Victor mean by his cryptic warning? Ethan felt the weight of the moment settling in his chest, and for the first time, he wondered if they had underestimated the dangers of this pursuit. "I'm not afraid of what you're trying to protect," Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Whatever it is, I'll find it, and I'll make sure the truth comes out." Victor's expression faltered, but only for a second. Then, with a casual motion, he gestured toward the desk. "You think you've come this far on your own, but you haven't. There are others who are pulling the strings, just as they've been pulling yours. You're in too deep now. You've crossed a line you can't come back from." Ethan took a step forward, feeling the weight of Victor's words, but he knew that this was the moment he'd been waiting for. He couldn't back down now. The truth was within reach, and nothing, not even Victor Carver's calculated warnings, could stop him from finding it. Victor stood up, his figure towering over them now. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "If you're so determined to learn the truth, then you'll learn it the hard way." In one swift motion, he pushed a button on his desk, and a hidden door in the wall opened, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. "After you," Victor said, his tone mocking but unmistakably serious. Ethan and Sarah stood at the edge of the open doorway, gazing down into the shadows below. The cold, damp air seemed to whisper secrets they weren't ready to hear. Victor's mocking words still hung in the air, an eerie reminder that they were stepping into a world much darker than they had imagined. The unknown abyss beneath them seemed like a metaphor for the path they had chosen, one filled with uncertainty, danger, and secrets that had been buried for far too long. Victor's cryptic warnings echoed in Ethan's mind. He spoke of strings being pulled, of things they didn't understand. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far. Ethan turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with determination. "We have to go down there," he said, his voice resolute despite the knot in his stomach. Sarah didn't hesitate. She nodded, her expression hardening with the same resolve. She had been through too much already, seen too many pieces of this puzzle fall into place. She wouldn't stop now, not when the truth was so close. They stepped forward together, descending the stairs into the darkness, the faint sound of their footsteps, the only sound in the silence that enveloped them. With each step, the weight of the unknown pressed harder on their shoulders, but neither of them faltered. As they reached the bottom, a dim light flickered on, revealing a small, sterile room with a single table at the center. On the table, there were stacks of documents, files, evidence of something they hadn't yet fully understood. The walls were lined with monitors, displaying various feeds, all of them showing live footage from different angles. It was clear that someone had been watching them, tracking their every move. Ethan approached the table, his fingers trembling as he picked up one of the files. His heart raced as he scanned the contents, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was seeing. These were the answers he'd been looking for, pieces of a puzzle that, when finally connected, would reveal the whole truth. "Victor knew we would find this," Sarah whispered as she examined the monitors, her eyes scanning the footage. "He's been watching us all along." Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze. "It's not just us, Sarah. He's been watching everyone. This is bigger than we thought." They continued to sift through the files, uncovering a network of names, dates, and connections that led them deeper into the web Victor had woven. But the more they discovered, the more questions arose. Why had Victor chosen to involve them? What was the end game? Suddenly, one of the monitors flickered, and the image on the screen shifted to a familiar face. Ethan's brother. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched his sibling on the screen, looking eerily calm, as if he had known this moment would come. The footage was old, but it was undeniable. It was him. Ethan felt his world tilt as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. His brother had been involved in this all along. He wasn't just a victim, he was a part of the plan. The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had been chasing the wrong truth, led down a path that had been manipulated from the very beginning. Sarah noticed his change in demeanor, her eyes widening in understanding. "Your brother. He's been part of this, hasn't he?" Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke. "I don't know, but I need to find out. I need to understand why." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway above them. They weren't alone anymore. Someone was coming. "We need to leave," Sarah urged, her hand grabbing Ethan's arm, but Ethan was already too far gone, consumed by the need for answers. He walked towards the door at the back of the room, the one that seemed to lead deeper into the labyrinth of secrets. As his fingers brushed against the handle, the door creaked open, revealing another dark corridor. The air in the hallway was thick with tension, but Ethan didn't stop. He had come too far to turn back now. A voice echoed from behind them. "Leaving so soon?" They both froze, turning to see Victor standing in the doorway, his face unreadable, his posture relaxed. He had been watching them the entire time, his presence looming over them, waiting for this very moment. Ethan's heart raced, but his resolve only grew stronger. "We're not leaving until we have answers." Victor's lips curled into a smile. "Then I suppose you'll have to keep going. But be careful. Sometimes the truth is far more dangerous than you can imagine." Ethan didn't flinch. He could feel Sarah's steady presence beside him, and together they took a step forward, not knowing what lay ahead, but certain that they would face it together. The truth was waiting, and they would find it, no matter the cost. The cold, clinical atmosphere of the underground room seemed to close in around Ethan and Sarah. The walls, covered in monitors and papers, felt like they were watching them, a reminder that they weren't just in a hidden space, they were part of something much larger, something dark and dangerous. Victor's presence still lingered in the air, his last words echoing in their minds. The truth was more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, but Ethan wasn't about to back down now. The deeper they went, the more their search for answers seemed to spiral into chaos. His brother's face on the screen, so calm, so composed, it was the last thing Ethan expected to see. His brother, the one person he thought he could trust, was connected to this twisted web. "What does this mean, Ethan?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes flicking from the screen to him. "Your brother. Why is he involved in this?" Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. His brother had always been the protector, the one who kept him grounded, safe from the chaos of the world. But now, seeing his face on those monitors, Ethan couldn't deny it any longer. His brother was no innocent bystander. He had been part of this from the beginning, and that knowledge hit Ethan like a hammer. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight. "I need to find him. I need to ask him myself." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to steady him. "But we don't know what's waiting for us out there. We've already seen how far Victor's willing to go to keep us in the dark." Ethan knew Sarah was right. They had barely scratched the surface of this mystery, and Victor was still out there pulling the strings. But that didn't change the fact that Ethan had to find his brother. The truth was buried, and he wouldn't stop until he had the answers. With renewed determination, Ethan turned away from the screen. "We're going to find him, and we're going to stop this, no matter what it takes." As they made their way out of the room, The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, sending a jolt of panic through Ethan's chest. They weren't alone. Someone was close. "Stay close," Sarah warned, her voice low, her hand already gripping the gun at her side. "We need to move fast." Ethan nodded, his focus unwavering. His brother was out there, and he was the key to unlocking the final pieces of this puzzle. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control faster than he could keep up with. They reached the end of the corridor and paused. The door ahead of them led into a larger chamber, one they hadn't seen before. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He could feel Sarah's presence beside him, her calm demeanor helping him push forward. As the door swung open, Ethan was struck by the sight before him. The room was dimly lit, filled with monitors, desks, and shelves covered in files. It was eerily familiar, but what caught his attention was the figure standing in the center of the room. There, in the middle of the room, stood his brother. But this wasn't the same person Ethan remembered. The calm, reassuring presence was gone, replaced by a man who seemed colder, more distant, as if he had been lost to the world. "Ethan," his brother said, his voice flat, almost devoid of emotion. "I knew you'd come looking for me." Ethan's chest tightened at the sight of him. "What is this? Why? Why are you involved in all of this?" His brother didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's not that simple. You wouldn't understand." Ethan clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "Try me." The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick, until his brother finally spoke again. "I didn't want you to get caught up in this, but you were always going to find out. I never meant for you to get dragged into it, Ethan. But once you started digging, there was no stopping it." Sarah stepped forward, her gaze sharp. "What are you talking about? What's going on here?" His brother sighed, running a hand through his hair, clearly conflicted. "It's bigger than you think. There's a group, one that's been operating in the shadows for years. I got involved because I thought it was the only way to protect you, protect both of us. But everything changed, and now it's too late." Ethan's mind was racing, but the one thing that stood out the most was the fear in his brother's voice. Something had gone horribly wrong, and his brother was no longer the person he used to be. "Protect me," Ethan repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "You've been lying to me this whole time, keeping secrets, and now you want to tell me you were trying to protect me?" His brother's eyes flickered, regret and pain flashing across his face. "I never wanted this. But you have to understand, Ethan, there's no going back now. The truth will change everything, and it's going to hurt you." Ethan stepped back, shaking his head. "I need to know everything. Now." His brother took a deep breath, then glanced at Sarah, his gaze hardened. "You're both in danger now. And if you want to survive, you need to leave. You can't stop this anymore." Ethan's blood ran cold as his brother's words sank in. "What do you mean? What's going to happen?" But before his brother could respond, the sound of the door slamming shut echoed behind them. The room was now locked, trapping them inside. And outside, they could hear footsteps, more than one set, coming toward them. "We don't have much time," his brother said, his voice urgent. "Victor has already set everything in motion, and now the real game is about to begin." The air in the room felt suffocating as the sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing down the narrow hall. Ethan's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. His brother's words rang in his ears. Victor had already set everything in motion. It was no longer just about finding answers, it was about survival. "Ethan, listen to me." His brother's voice broke through the tension. "Victor is much more dangerous than you realize. If he finds out you're here, everything we've done will be for nothing." Sarah stepped closer to Ethan, her eyes scanning the room for an escape route. "We don't have much time, Ethan. We need to figure out our next move." Ethan glanced around, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. The monitors, the shelves, the locked door, it was all a trap. But the more he thought, the more he realized they were already inside the trap. The walls, the people, the situation, it was all designed to bring them here at this exact moment. But why? His brother's cold gaze shifted toward the corner of the room where a small hidden panel was barely visible. "That's your way out," his brother said quietly. "It's the only way, but once you leave, there's no turning back. Victor will come after you. He's relentless." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "We don't have a choice. We're not leaving without a fight." Sarah's hand tightened around her weapon, her posture ready for whatever came next. "Then let's make sure we're ready. We're not just running anymore. It's time to end this." The room suddenly felt like it was closing in on them. Every second that passed only intensified the pressure. Ethan's brother stepped back as if giving them space to make their decision. His eyes flicked nervously toward the door. "I never wanted this for you, Ethan," his brother said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "But now you have to finish it. Only you can stop Victor." The words hit Ethan harder than expected. His brother, the person he trusted most, had known about Victor's plans all along. And now he was asking Ethan to carry the weight of stopping it. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving his brother's face. "Then I'll finish it. I'll stop him." Without another word, Ethan moved toward the hidden panel, Sarah right behind him. His brother's gaze lingered on them for a moment before he turned away, the weight of the decision he had made hanging heavy in the air. As Ethan pressed against the panel, it slid open with a faint click, revealing a narrow corridor that led deeper into the building. The darkness beyond the door seemed to beckon them, and with one final glance back at his brother, Ethan stepped into the unknown. The corridor stretched ahead of them, cold and uninviting, but it was their only option. The sound of distant footsteps grew louder, signaling that time was running out. They had to move quickly. Ethan and Sarah moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick silence of the underground complex. Every corner, every turn, felt like it was leading them further into the heart of Victor's twisted empire. And as they continued down the dark corridor, Ethan's thoughts were consumed with one question: what had his brother truly been a part of? They reached a set of large doors, reinforced and heavily guarded. The tension in the air was palpable. They were close, so close, but they couldn't afford any mistakes now. Ethan motioned for Sarah to stay back as he approached the door, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the control panel beside it. "Are you ready?" Sarah's voice was steady, despite the uncertainty that hung in the air. Ethan didn't respond right away. He couldn't find the words to explain the turmoil swirling inside him. His brother, the one person he trusted, had been part of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. And now Ethan had to make a choice: stop Victor and whatever his plan was, or risk losing everything. He pressed the button, and the doors slowly began to open. The room beyond was bathed in harsh fluorescent light, revealing a massive control center, monitors, wires, and data flowing across screens in an endless stream of information. But there was something else. In the center of the room, behind a desk covered in papers, stood Victor, the man who had orchestrated everything. Victor turned slowly, his smile predatory. "I knew you'd come eventually, Ethan. You're too much like your brother." Ethan's chest tightened as the man's words hit him like a punch to the gut. His brother had been a part of this, but what was Victor's ultimate goal? "You've done well to get this far," Victor continued, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "But it's too late now. The plan is already in motion. You can't stop it." Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not here to stop the plan, Victor. I'm here to stop you." Victor's laughter echoed through the room, filling the space with an eerie sense of dread. "You think you can stop me? After everything I've done? You have no idea what you're up against." Ethan didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he would end it all. "You're wrong," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I know exactly what I'm up against." And with those words, the final battle for control of the future began. The fate of everyone, Ethan, Sarah, his brother, was about to be decided in this one room. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the door to the control room slowly slid open, revealing the man who had been orchestrating the chaos all along, Victor. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the rows of monitors and wires that buzzed with life. Victor, standing tall behind a desk, cluttered with papers, turned to face them. His smile was chilling, his eyes filled with cold calculation. "I knew you'd come," Victor said, his voice calm and almost amused. "It's only a matter of time, Ethan. You're just like your brother, always trying to fix things that can't be fixed." Ethan's breath hitched at the mention of his brother, the weight of everything crashing down on him. His brother had been a part of this, the lies, the manipulation, the twisted web Victor had woven. The realization stung, but there was no time to dwell on it. Victor's smug expression only fueled Ethan's anger. "You've done everything to ruin lives." Ethan spat, his voice steady despite the fury inside him. "And you think you can just walk away from it all?" Victor's eyes gleamed with arrogance as he took a step forward, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "I don't need to walk away, Ethan. I've already won. Everything I've worked for is set in motion. The world will be mine soon, and nothing you do will stop that." Ethan's grip on the edge of the desk tightened. The words burned in his mind, but there was no room for doubt. He had come this far. He wasn't backing down. "Your plan ends now," Ethan said, his voice low but unwavering. "You're not going to get away with it." Victor chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair. "You think you're the hero in this story, Ethan? You think you can just stop me with a few words? You've already lost." As Victor spoke, the sound of a door creaking open behind them startled Ethan and Sarah. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end. He spun around, eyes scanning the room, looking for any signs of danger. But nothing. Victor, however, seemed unfazed. "You should have known, Ethan," he continued. "You can't just waltz into my world and expect to take control. You're out of your depth." Ethan's mind raced. There had to be something he was missing, something that would turn the tide in their favor. But in that moment, it became clear. Victor wasn't just a man. He was a force, a powerful entity with resources beyond anything Ethan could have imagined. "You've played this game too long, Victor," Sarah's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. She stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Victor's with unwavering resolve. "But the game's over. You've underestimated us." Victor raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Sarah's boldness. "Underestimated? You think you stand a chance against me, girl?" Before Sarah could respond, the air in the room seemed to shift. A faint noise, a hum of machinery, a low rumble, began to fill the silence. Victor's expression faltered, a flicker of something almost imperceptible passing through his eyes. His facade of control was slipping. Ethan seized the opportunity. "This ends here, Victor," he declared, stepping forward with purpose. "Everything you've built is about to come crashing down." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to cut through with a knife. Ethan's gaze remained locked on Victor, the man responsible for the twisted chain of events that had led him here. He wasn't going to let Victor manipulate them any longer. Victor's smirk faded as the reality of the situation began to settle in. The walls that had once protected him were crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it now. He had underestimated them, underestimated Ethan. "You won't win, Ethan," Victor said, his voice tinged with desperation for the first time. "You can't stop the inevitable." Ethan didn't hesitate. His voice rang with the finality of someone who had been through hell and wasn't afraid anymore. "We already have." The next moments unfolded like a blur. There was no more time for talking. The weight of the battle they had fought, the struggles they had endured, all came to a head in the next few seconds. Ethan moved with lightning speed, taking advantage of Victor's momentary lapse in focus. In the distance, Sarah's quick reflexes came into play as well, ensuring that nothing could stop them now. Victor's empire, built on lies and manipulation, was finally beginning to crumble. Ethan could feel the weight of victory within his grasp, but he knew it wasn't over yet. They still had to ensure that Victor couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Ethan stood at the edge of the dimly lit hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. The letter he had received, the one that had set everything into motion, was still in his pocket, its weight now a constant reminder of everything he had uncovered. The secrets, the lies, the betrayals, it had all come crashing down on him in one moment. He could still feel the tension in the air, thick with unspoken words. His family was gathered in the next room, uncertain of the storm that was about to hit them. Ethan knew they would never be the same after this. But there was no turning back. He couldn't live with the guilt of keeping the truth hidden any longer. As he walked down the hallway toward the living room, his steps felt heavier with each passing second. He had been afraid of their reactions, of their disbelief, but now he was resolute. He had uncovered the truth. He had the power to change everything. It wasn't just about exposing the lies anymore. It was about facing his own fears and taking responsibility for what had happened. Ethan paused outside the living room door, took a deep breath, and then pushed it open. Inside, his parents were sitting on the couch talking quietly. The moment they saw him, everything stopped. Their gazes locked on him, as if they had been waiting for him to make the first move. And in that moment, Ethan knew this was it. He could finally bring everything to light. He stepped forward, the letter still clutched tightly in his hand. "Mom, Dad," he said, his voice firm but calm. "There's something you need to see, something you need to hear, and it's time I told you the truth." His mother looked at him with concern in her eyes. "What is it, Ethan?" she asked softly. "What's going on?" Ethan hesitated for a brief moment, gathering his courage, before he pulled out the crumpled letter. He unfolded it slowly, almost as if he was afraid it would crumble in his hands. The words he had feared to say aloud for so long now hung between them like a heavy weight. As Ethan read aloud from the letter, the words seemed to echo in the room. Each sentence that left his lips felt like a hammer, striking down the carefully constructed facade that had held his family together for so long. "Mom, Dad." Ethan's voice faltered slightly as he continued. "This letter was sent to me anonymously, but I think you both know what it means." He paused, locking eyes with his parents. "It's about the trust that's been broken." The room fell silent. His mother's face contorted with confusion, but there was something deeper beneath her shock. A flicker of recognition, perhaps. His father, on the other hand, appeared almost unreadable, his features hardening as he processed the situation. Ethan knew what he had to do next. He had spent so long tiptoeing around the truth, trying to protect everyone from the fallout. But in this moment, he realized that protecting them now would be the greatest disservice of all. The truth needed to be heard, no matter how difficult. He continued reading, his voice growing more confident with each word. The letter says, "Your life is built on secrets, and if you want to know the truth, you'll have to face it. What you've been told is a lie." His mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at his father, who hadn't yet moved a muscle. Ethan watched them both carefully. He could feel the tension in the air, a sharp contrast to the warmth and comfort that the living room once held. "What does this mean, Ethan?" his father finally asked. his tone cold and distant. "Who sent you this letter? Why are you doing this?" Ethan's throat tightened, but he managed to speak. It was someone who knew everything, someone who saw the cracks in our family, and someone who wanted to make sure the truth was known. His father stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You're letting some anonymous letter dictate your actions. Do you have any idea what you're accusing us of?" Ethan's heart pounded harder in his chest. He had expected resistance, but it didn't make it any easier. "I don't know exactly who sent it, but I know what's inside, and I know it's true." He looked his father dead in the eye. "There's something you're hiding, something you've been hiding from all of us." His mother remained seated, her face pale, eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan could see the cracks beginning to form in her composure. She had always been the more understanding one, the one who wanted to believe in the good of people, but even she couldn't deny the weight of the truth that now hung in the air. Ethan's words lingered in the room, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, his father broke the silence with a sigh, his voice low. "Fine. What do you think you know, Ethan? Tell me." There was a hint of anger beneath his words, but also something else, something almost like resignation. Ethan stood tall, his body tense with anticipation. His heart was racing, but his voice remained steady, grounded in the truth he had held onto for far too long. "I know about the affair," he said quietly, almost whispering, as if the words themselves carried an unbearable weight. His mother's eyes widened, and her hand trembled as she slowly pulled it away from her mouth. For a brief moment, her face appeared to be a mask of disbelief. His father, too, looked as though the words had struck him like a blow. You what?" his father muttered, taking a step back. His gaze flickered from Ethan to his wife, as if trying to find any hint of confirmation or denial. Ethan didn't flinch. "The letter said it all. You've been hiding it for years, Dad. The affair, the lies you've told Mom and all of us." The room felt colder as the truth seemed to settle in, wrapping its suffocating grip around everyone in the room. His mother's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She held her composure, almost as if she were trying to convince herself that this couldn't be happening. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice shaking. How did you know about this?" Ethan's eyes softened, the pain of revealing this truth evident in his expression. "It wasn't easy to figure out," he said, his voice carrying the burden of the journey he had taken to get here. "But after everything, the signs were all there, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, and finally, the letter. The one that confirmed everything." His father's face flushed with anger, but there was something deeper in his eyes, a flicker of shame, of guilt that he couldn't suppress. Ethan had known his father long enough to recognize that look. It was the look of a man who had been caught, the look of someone who had tried to bury his mistakes for so long, only to have them resurface in the worst possible way. His father's voice cracked as he spoke. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know. I thought if I could just fix things, move on, it would all be over." Ethan shook his head slowly. "But you didn't fix anything. You just kept building a house of lies, Dad. And now, we're all paying for it." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they had just uncovered. Ethan could see his mother, her face pale and streaked with the beginning of tears. She had never imagined that the man she had loved and trusted for so long could betray her in such a way. His father stood there, silent, his head lowered in shame. Ethan watched him, waiting for some kind of response. But the room was filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing, heavy and uncertain. Ethan wasn't sure what he had expected from this moment, but it certainly wasn't the crushing silence that followed. His father had never been the kind of man to admit his mistakes openly, and yet here they were in this broken moment where the truth had shattered everything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his father spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Ethan's eyes softened, and he took a step toward his father, the anger in his chest slowly giving way to something else, something close to relief. "I'm not the one you should apologize to," he said quietly. "You need to apologize to Mom." His father looked at his wife, and for the first time there was genuine remorse in his eyes. As his father looked toward his mother, Ethan could see the conflict in his father's eyes. There was a flicker of hope, a faint wish that the damage could somehow be undone with words alone. But the truth was far from that simple. His mother, who had been standing there silently, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, took a deep breath. She looked at her husband, her expression a mixture of hurt and disbelief. The tears in her eyes threatened to spill over, but she remained composed, fighting to keep the emotions at bay. "You think saying sorry is enough?" she asked, her voice calm, but laced with sorrow. "Do you have any idea what you've done? All these years of lies, all the times I believed in you, trusted you, and you were out there, deceiving me, breaking everything we had. You took that from me, from us." Her words, though spoken softly, were like daggers piercing through the fragile space between them. Ethan could feel the pain radiating from her, the raw emotion that had been buried for years now surfacing with a force that could no longer be ignored. His father's face tightened and his lips quivered. The apology, the words that had come so easily moments ago, now seemed hollow. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, and he couldn't hide it any longer. "I never meant to hurt you," his father said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I was selfish. I was stupid. I didn't think of how it would affect you or Ethan. I was just trying to fix my own mess." His mother's eyes burned with a quiet fire. By lying, by living a double life. What about me? What about our family? Did you ever stop to think about what this would do to us? To me? She paused for a moment, steadying herself. "I gave you everything, and you broke me." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan watched his mother, her eyes now glistening with unshed tears. His father stood across from her, his head hung low, his body stiff with regret. This was it, the moment where everything they had known was laid bare. The foundation they had built their lives on had cracked, and no apology, no matter how sincere, could ever truly fix that. Ethan's heart ached for his mother. He could feel the crushing weight of her pain, but he also felt a small flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could start to rebuild. Maybe they could start the process of healing, even if it would take time. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but it would be theirs to walk together. His mother's voice, though still soft, was firm now. "I don't know what to say to you, Daniel. I don't know if I can ever forgive you." His father nodded, the guilt still heavy on his shoulders. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did, for everything I've done to you." Ethan could see the sincerity in his father's eyes. There was no magic fix, no easy way to undo the hurt, but he had admitted the truth, and that was a start. His father wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was asking for a chance to prove he could change, to prove that he was willing to make amends. The room fell silent once again. Ethan stood by, torn between his parents, watching them in this vulnerable moment. His heart ached for them both, for the brokenness they had shared and the uncertain road ahead. But in this quiet, shared pain, there was also a strange sense of closure. The truth was no longer hidden. It was out there, exposed, raw and painful, but it was the truth. His father finally raised his head, his eyes meeting his wife's. "I can't take back the years I've wasted, but I can work towards becoming a better man, a better father, a better husband. I won't ever stop trying." His mother looked at him, her gaze softening just slightly, though the hurt still lingered in her eyes. She wiped away a single tear, her fingers trembling, and then took a step toward him. She didn't speak at first. There was no need for words. The silence between them was filled with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that had yet to be healed. Ethan watched them, understanding that their journey was far from over. This wasn't a fairy tale where everything was fixed with a simple apology. The road ahead would be long, filled with hard work and painful conversations, but it was theirs to walk. And then, as if the unspoken weight had been lifted, his mother nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll see." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a seed planted, ready to be nurtured with time and patience. Ethan's heart swelled as he saw the tiniest glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new for them, something stronger, something that could grow from the rubble of their broken trust. It wasn't going to be easy. It would take years, perhaps a lifetime, to rebuild what had been lost. But the first step had been taken. They had spoken the truth. They had faced the hard reality. And now they could start the long journey toward healing. As the evening drew to a close, the family shared a quiet moment together. It wasn't the perfect ending. There was no magic solution, no quick fix. But in their hearts, they all knew one thing. They would try. They would try to move forward, together. As the evening quieted down, a heavy silence filled the room. Ethan looked around at his family, his father, his mother, and himself. The air was thick with the rawness of their shared emotions. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, not yet, but there was something undeniably different in the way they now sat together. The air was no longer filled with secrets, lies, or unresolved tension. The truth had been laid bare, and though it was painful, it was also the first step toward healing. Ethan's father sat back in his chair, his shoulders hunched but his face resolute. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. There was no magic reset button that could undo the damage years of dishonesty had caused. But for the first time, in a long time, he could see a glimpse of a way forward. He wasn't the man he had once been, but perhaps, just maybe, he could rebuild who he was meant to be. And perhaps, with time, his wife would see that effort. Ethan's mother sat across from him, still guarded but with a faint softness in her eyes. She hadn't forgiven him, not yet. But she could see that her husband was finally acknowledging the weight of his actions. That was more than she had ever hoped for. The night had taken a toll on her too, not just emotionally, but mentally. The hurt was fresh, but so was the realization that healing, though slow, was now possible. Ethan, caught in the middle of it all, was learning too. He had seen the good and bad in both of his parents over the years. He had seen their love, their arguments, and their distance. But tonight he had seen something he hadn't expected, an openness to change. The truth had cracked open the door to a new beginning. It wasn't the ending they had hoped for, but it was a beginning. And that was enough. As the hours passed and the weight of the day slowly sank in, a simple truth emerged. Sometimes, the hardest path is the one that leads to truth. The kind of truth that isn't wrapped in comfort or easy answers, but one that demands vulnerability. The kind of truth that hurts, that exposes flaws, yet also holds the power to heal if embraced fully. This story was never just about Ethan exposing his father's secrets. It was about the consequences of avoiding the truth for so long, the pain that accumulates when we choose silence over confrontation. But it was also about redemption, the possibility that after a storm of hurt there could be calm. The moral here isn't about blaming the past. It's about looking to the future. It's about recognizing that no matter how deep the wound, there is a chance to rebuild, to start anew. In life, we often shy away from difficult conversations because we're afraid of what they might cost us. But as Ethan's family learned that night, the price of ignoring the truth is far higher. The relationships that matter most, whether with family, friends, or even ourselves, require us to be honest no matter the cost. It's not easy, but the rewards are immeasurable. So, the lesson here, the truth will always find a way to the surface. It may take time and it may hurt, but facing it head-on allows us to grow, to learn, and ultimately to heal. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a situation where the truth came out in the most unexpected way? What was it like for you? Was there a moment when you had to choose between silence and speaking up? How did that impact your relationships? It's never easy to confront the truth, but when we do, it changes everything, often in ways we never imagined. Think about it for a second. In your own life, have you ever felt the weight of an untold story? Or have you had to watch someone you care about go through the consequences of keeping something hidden? The truth can be a powerful force for change, but it's also a delicate thing. Once revealed, it can either build bridges or burn them, and sometimes it's up to us to decide what to do next. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We all go through difficult moments, and hearing your stories might help someone else find the courage to face their own truth. Life is full of difficult decisions. Sometimes we hide things to protect the people we love. But what we often forget is that the truth has the power to protect us too. The act of being honest, not just with others but with ourselves, creates a foundation of trust, the very thing that all strong relationships are built on. After everything Ethan and his family had been through, the real victory wasn't just in the secrets coming to light. It was in their willingness to rebuild from the wreckage. Relationships aren't perfect and people aren't perfect. But the key to moving forward is understanding that we don't have to be stuck in our mistakes or carry the burden of our secrets forever. We can choose to heal, to forgive, and to learn. So as you watch this story unfold, think about your own life. What changes would you make if you truly embraced honesty and transparency in your relationships? What could you gain by facing the uncomfortable truths that you've been avoiding? Reflect on your journey and ask yourself, what's the next step toward healing in your own life? Take a moment and let that question linger. We all have a choice in how we move forward. The truth, though hard at times, will always guide us toward the better version of ourselves. As we wrap up this journey together, remember this: the courage to speak the truth isn't something that just happens. It's a decision. And it's a decision that can transform everything. Now, I encourage you to take this moment for reflection and apply it to your own life. Think about the people around you, family, friends, colleagues, and consider what truths might be left unspoken. Maybe there's a conversation waiting to happen, something you've been avoiding, or a relationship that could be mended with honesty. Don't wait for the storm to force the truth out. Be proactive. Take that first step. It doesn't matter how small it seems. What matters is the commitment to speak and hear the truth, no matter how hard it might be. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know how you've faced difficult truths and what you've learned in the process. We would love to hear from you, and your words could inspire someone else who might be in a similar situation. If you found this video meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories. And remember, every truth revealed is a step closer to a more authentic, connected life.